Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this show, which is designed to give all of us a little more insight into what goes on in and around our state capital here in Salem. We particularly like to get to know the folks who are involved in government either directly or indirectly, and today I am particularly interested in having you learn a little bit more about my guest because he's my successor in office, Representative-elect Tom Whelan.
Kevin, thank you.
Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
This is an interesting transition for me since after 8 years as a representative, I get to introduce the person who's going to step into my seat come January 13th. What we try to do is get some idea about the person's background, and of course you've been through all these candidate forums and everything else, but now, without having anyone else around that you have to compare yourself to, can you give us some sort of idea of what your background is, what your family's like?
Sure. I actually a Portland kid. Went to high school in North Portland, Roosevelt, and came down here for college in the late 60s at Willamette. And so this was my first brush with Willamette nearly 30 years ago, or with Salem 30 years ago. And I've been here on and off since then. Most of the last 25, 28 years I have actually been living here in Salem. For the last 18 years, I've been a firefighter on the City of Salem Fire Department. I'm a captain at the Battle Creek Fire Station now. And I'll be taking, hopefully, no more than a 6-month leave of absence starting the 13th of January.
Tell us a little bit about your family.
Okay. I've been married for 25 years. I met my wife at Willamette. She was a year behind me. We've been married for 25 years this last October. I've got a 12-year-old daughter who goes to Abaquois School, and she's a 7th grader. I'm fresh out of their Christmas program this morning. She's an actress. She's, in fact, a professional actress. She in fact, at the time we would have been celebrating our 25th anniversary on October 29th. My wife was back in Richmond, Virginia, while they were shooting a Christmas movie for the Family Channel. Christmas Every Day was the name of it, and it's been showing over the holidays here, and will be showing for the final time on Christmas Day. So my wife has to tail her along on her adventures. She spends, Julia, my daughter, spends a good deal of time both in L.A. We'll be going back down after the start of the year and continues to audition for movies. And my wife will just be tagging along, so I'll probably be a bachelor for more time than I really care to be during the session.
Well, this is an interesting dichotomy because sometimes people might say that acting and politics have a lot in common, and you have a daughter who's an actress, an actor is the way we call it these days. I guess it's not gender specific.
That's right.
And here you are in politics. Now, in terms of that, do you have a background in political office, or is this your first shot at it?
This is my first. I'll tell you, my father was a politician. He was in the legislature from, I think, 59 session through the 65 session. And so I grew up in that world. About the age my daughter is now, I was going through that, and it was not something I particularly enjoyed. You've got children, and you're a very prominent political figure, and I suppose at times they can be ambivalent about it, and I know I was at that age. A lot of times when you're 12, 13, 14, you want the world to stay at arm's length, and that's pretty difficult when your father's a public figure. And so it's just rather circumstance that brought me back into politics. As I said, I've been a firefighter for several years, and or several decades now. But in the early 80s, 81 I believe it was, Roger Brandenburg, who was a Portland firefighter and the president of the Oregon State Firefighters Council, became suddenly ill and passed away rather abruptly and without warning, and so I took over the legislative director's job for the Oregon State Firefighters Council, and then got back into politics at that time after being out of it very happily for 10, 15 years. So that's what brought me back into it.
And were you recruited to run for state representative?
I was. In fact, I had been approached in years past and I just didn't have the time for it. I was trying to raise a daughter. One of the reasons I got out of it in the first place is I work a 56-hour week as a firefighter. I found myself spending endless hours at the Capitol, and even in the interim there was always a ballot measure or something going on. As you know, it's not something you just dart in and out of. And so I just simply had to make a choice. I saw my daughter getting to be 1, 2 years old, and I wasn't going to see much of her, and it was 10 times as much fun having a child as I expected it to be, and I just bailed out. I went back in, served a term. I was appointed by Governor Goldschmidt to the Purse Board. And
that's the Public Employees
Retirement System Board in 1987. I served a term there, but other than that, for the last 10 years, I've pretty much sat it out. I got back involved in politics locally about 2 or 3 years ago. Some of the neighbors and myself wanted to get our fire station reopened. The Battle Creek Fire Station had been shut down for about 10 years. And we launched an attack, and were successful in getting it reopened, and I was then reassigned there. And I guess that caused enough public stir that I was approached when you decided to run for Attorney General. I was approached, and at that time it worked out in my life, and sounded interesting, so here I am.
So here you are, and already as representative-elect, and that means you've been elected, but you've not been sworn in yet. You've been involved in a lot of meetings, I take it, to get you used to what this is all about?
Absolutely, endless. Endless. In fact, I was at Costco the other day, and I went out and got a big plastic impulse buy file box, and that was it was about 1.5 feet square, and I filled it up to just to the top with what I've received in the last week and a half. So it's coming in a lot faster than I can manage to read it.
Now, in terms of this transition, you've had to run through a campaign, you ran in the primary, then got elected in November. Are you finding that there's some adjustments you're going to need to make in terms of the home situation? You mentioned your daughter and her actor work, and your wife following that. Now, your situation's a little different from other representatives who have to come in from way out of town.
Oh, yeah.
But have you made some adjustments in terms of how you're going to schedule things, or have you worked your way through that yet?
Yeah, I'm going to have to take a leave of absence from the fire department. There's no way I could. We work 24-hour shifts with 48 off. It gives you some useful time, but I cannot work that around a legislative schedule in good conscience, and so I'm just simply going to have to take a leave of absence.
Now, that will be during the actual session when the legislature is meeting at least 5 days a week. Following session, I guess you have to just make adjustments or see how it is in terms of the demands on your time as a representative.
What I plan now, and I certainly will, as soon as the session's over, I'll be back in the engine house.
I have a friendly recommendation, and it's something that I'll just pass on, and that is, after session, you also need to start learning to say no to some things. I was amazed at the number of organizations that want you to serve on their boards or to be an advisory of this or advisory that, and if you accept all those invitations, you won't have time to do your job as a representative.
Exactly. I can see that. I can see that coming now.
Well, one of the other things I should mention to our audience is I usually tell you how you can reach me with questions or concerns, but that really won't be all that effective anymore. So although I can tell you that you're watching Capitol Insight, and if you have questions or concerns, I usually give you the address of H395 State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. That's still okay for a couple of weeks. And you can still contact me about things. I'm still in office. But after January 13, the person that you're supposed to contact is Tom Whelan, representative for District 32. And you might mention what your address is, if you're willing to, on the air, where people should write to you. Should they write to you still care of the state capitol, or do you prefer to get the mail at home?
Right to the state capitol. That's where I'm going to be staying. I do know the phone number at this early stage. I suppose it's your phone number. It's 986-1432. Isn't that it?
Yes, it is. They use the code of the district for the last two digits. 986-1432.
That's right. And the 4 is 1, and the 4 is H on the alphanumeric pad, and so and it's District 32. So it's 986-1432. And I don't have any idea what office I'm going to have at this time.
Now, what about staffing for a session? Have you made some decisions about that?
Yeah, I have. I've got a a legislative assistant who was my campaign manager. He's a whip-smart kid out of Willamette, just graduated last year. He was a student body president there. He's got the most lyrical name. He will have the most lyrical name in the Capitol. It's Dimitri Palmatier, and that's a dandy moniker. But he will be my legislative assistant, and I am discussing some secretarial prospects with a lady who worked there for Senator Leonard and Senator Cease last year. In fact, she's the daughter of a retired Salem firefighter who asked me to give her a call if I were ever elected, and I did, having no idea she'd be so well qualified. And so I was delighted after giving her a courtesy call to find out that she'd be a marvelous prospect. So she will be my secretary. I'd like my wife to spend some time down there, but there's no, for the interim particularly, but there's no assurance that she'll be available. Our plans are pretty much up in the air at this time.
Now, in terms of the issues, are there some issues that you focused on during the campaign that you think will be hot prospects for discussion this coming session?
Yeah, and I've mentioned to some of my supporters in recent correspondence that a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. I was all set to really focus on trying to bring some stable funding to the public schools. I just think the state of higher education in Oregon is desperate, and I was hoping to redirect some resources for those goals, and my district agreed with me, and Measure 47 passed. And so now all bets are off. Those problems are still there. They've got to be dealt with. Fortunately, the economy continues to be healthy. I can't recall this prolonged an expansion in my adult life. It's not going to last forever. I hope we can bring some relief to the schools and start to rebuild our higher education system. But it's going to be made more difficult by.
Do you see prospects for some compromise in regard to the kicker law? Now, the kicker law says that we have to project what the income tax collections are going to be, and then if we receive more than 2% beyond the projections in any given 2-year period, that all that money has to be sent back. So if you project $100, you're okay. And if you project $100 and you get $101.99, you're okay. But if you get $102, you have to send all $2 back. Now, that's always a controversial requirement, especially since economists have told me that even for private corporations, you're lucky to be within 4% for projections for a year, much less 2% for 2 years. But the debate going on now between Governor Kitzhaber and the Republican leadership is he's saying we need to keep that money or some of it for education funding. They're saying no, we need to send it back or maybe refer it to the voters. Have you heard any discussion of a reform where there's a different formula, say first percent, you can still use it, second percent, go into a reserve fund, beyond that, then you send it back, something like that, or
not to this point. Not to this point. In fact, I asked Speaker-elect Lundquist, I met with him this morning on committee assignments, and I'd hoped to be assigned a revenue. But that's all up in the air. I probably won't know till well after Christmas. But there's all types of ideas, I think, floating around on the kicker. I think as it stands right now, the Republicans have been pretty insistent about wanting to keep it the way it is. The Democrats are all over the place. I know personally, I never, during my campaign, discussed touching the personal kicker because to keep the personal kicker as well as a corporate does nothing to address the question of tax fairness and equity between corporate and individual and small business taxpayers. And so to keep both the kickers and leave all other factors the status quo, it really does nothing to address that problem. So I'm not in favor of it right now. And we've got probably 3 more revenue reporting periods before we know for sure how much the kicker is, and like you say, it's almost impossible to predict corporate net income or gross incomes, and it's as you approach the end of a period of economic expansion, which we most certainly must be getting somewhere near it, it's probably going to become difficult to even predict what the individual income tax revenues are going to be.
Do you think that there's some desirability to have a formula that's inviolate as opposed to this constant? I mean, every session I've served, 4 sessions, 4 terms, there was always a debate about what to do with the kicker money and whether or not something should go back or something should be kept. Could it be that we'd ever achieve a formula approach where we say, hey, it's set in stone, this much gets kept, this much goes back, and I'd add, this much goes into a reserve for the days when we get less than we projected?
You know, that would be wonderful, and that would be particularly valuable to this community, which relies heavily on, has the bulk of the administrative branch of Oregon government here, and a lot of salaries. Every time the corporate income, or the personal income tax drops, we're looking at finding ways to tack the budget together, cut programs. Salem government workers are constantly at risk. Now we've got the additional problem of having basically the school system at risk. We have not had an economic downturn since we've basically taken over the public school system by the income tax of the state of Oregon. So you look at a 10%, 15% cut in income tax revenues, which is not uncommon during a period of economic readjustment. And, you know, we're talking about having to carve $1 billion plus out of the schools and state programs, which are centered here in Salem. We're sitting on a bubble. I'd sure like to find a good way out of it, a simple way out of it, understandable to all Oregonians. And I think that rainy day fund, or that having a reserve, a shock absorber, if you will, would be a wonderful, wonderful thing to have.
Now, in terms of the committee process, you mentioned that you've talked to Speaker-elect, or presumed Speaker-elect Lundquist. Technically, the Republicans have met and they said he's going to be their Speaker guy, but officially he's not even Speaker-elect until the legislature convenes and votes to elect him, and then he's immediately sworn in. But just to be technical about it. But in dealing with the process of preparation, I noticed that we've seen news coverage now about the selection of the Republicans who will chair the committees. The Republicans have a majority of the House and the Senate. Therefore, they'll have a majority of the committee membership, and the committee chairs will be Republicans. You're a Democrat. You're in the minority in the House. How do you see that committee selection process? You mentioned you wanted to be on revenue. Is it going to be a matter of watching all the Republicans line up first to get on committees, and then the Democrats get what's left?
You got it. Well, I think Representative Lundquist must know something we don't, because as I left his office this morning, he was moving from the majority leader's office into the Speaker's office, so I think he's getting the green light from his caucus.
Well, informally, we know that he will be the Speaker. I just have a little fun with that, because officially,
that's right.
Nothing official has happened.
Things can happen.
Technically, the House elects a Speaker, and you could have a coalition who votes for somebody, but in history, it just doesn't happen that way. And sometimes our citizens wonder about it. They see so much partisanship in this process. It's all Democrats, all Republicans. Do you have a reaction to that part of it, the partisanship that you're already running into?
Yeah, I do. And the funny thing about that is, my first brush with capital politics here as an elected official was to meet with my caucus. And the funny thing is, in the months intervening between the general election and the actual start of the session, you have the caucuses meeting among themselves, and it's kind of a tribal thing. It's so easy to loathe your enemies until you actually meet them. So you hear rumors about what the other side has got up their sleeve, and paranoia rules the roost over there. And we've started to have orientations, and I've got to meet some of these folks from the Republican caucus, and they're just, I mean, they're delightful people. And so I know it's, Speaker Lundquist is just a fine gentleman, and just extremely congenial fellow. And I know it's his desire to crank down the partisanship a bit. He'd love to see a less contentious legislature. Feels, I think sincerely, that it would be best for the state if we were able to put something like that together. And I know that's certainly the way I feel. these were mean streets last session, and I know District 32 and the citizens of Salem are tired of that. Personally, it offended me. Some of the more firebrand folks, I'm thinking of Representative Tiernan, won't be back this time, and hopefully the tenor can be just a bit more civilized this time.
Do you see some change too in terms of how you mentioned the caucuses being almost tribal in nature, which I found interesting because you're fresh to it, but already you've picked up on that. And there is this business of, well, let's all go in our room and talk about them. And as though there's some other weird creatures out there in the other party.
Yeah.
Do you see some work being done between the caucuses across from the Senate and the House? You know, there's some distance there, too.
Mm-hmm.
There's this gap that seems to exist.
There really is. And I've wondered about that myself. I think there's going to be a good relationship between Peter Courtney, our leader, and Lynn Lundquist, the speaker. But that there's a considerable gap in political demographics, if you will, between the House and the Senate. The Senate is strongly Republican, and I think it's a conservative Republican caucus. And so I haven't been able to get a handle on how that's going to play off, but I think that's where the drama is going to be.
It's interesting to note that in terms of the House versus the Senate, the House, in all the 4 terms I've been there, and now this next time around, it's pretty close usually, the division between Democrats and Republicans. In the Senate, it's swayed from heavy Democratic, now it's heavy Republican. Those 4-year terms don't seem to balance things out as much as people say.
It's absolutely amazing. Like I remember back in the early 80s, it was just as strongly Democrat, as I recall, as it's now Republican. And that's a huge swing. That's an enormous...
So much for the theory that the Senate with longer terms is less susceptible to these swings.
Right.
And I should mention the Senate, for our audience, the Senate is a 4-year term, the House is a 2-year term, and so senators get to draw a bye in effect every election cycle. You don't, you're up every 2 years. Have you had much opportunity to see how the senators seem to consider themselves as opposed to the members of the House?
No, I've heard that they're not nearly as much fun.
Well, they take themselves very seriously.
That's right. They're very serious. And that's funny. I suppose you would. The Democratic caucus is now down to 10 over there, and I don't know if they meet in a phone booth or where, but it's a pretty... I think, given the numbers, the small numbers, that they tend to think of themselves as more elite than the rabble across the hall.
Well, those of us who are among the rabble always insisted when the media would ask us, are you going to run for the Senate, a promotion or an improvement? I always call it a transfer. Try to maintain that mentality. Well, let me ask you a little more about committees. You mentioned revenue. Are there some particular bills that you want to see worked on, that you want to work on personally? There's always the global stuff, but then there's the smaller, more focused stuff. Are there any particular issues from the Salem perspective that you're going to be playing with?
No, the reason revenue interests me, if there was some handle we could get on financing, public finance in Oregon, some way to decrease our dependence on the property tax. We've done it through Measure 47 this last time, but even then property taxes are simply too high. They cannot be made progressive. We're looking at the next century where the pundits at least say that people are going to be bouncing in and out of jobs for the duration of their professional careers. Now that means they're going to be without work at times, and that's anxious in itself. It causes anxiety in itself, but the property tax is there whether you can afford to pay it or not. And if we could somehow find some way to move ourselves into a position where we're less and less dependent on the property tax, I think the general tenor of anxiety with respect to revenue issues should quiet down some. I'd like to use the opportunity of being in the Revenue Committee to take a broad look at how the rest of the country finances their state. I spent an interesting time back in New Hampshire. A couple of years ago, I went back to visit a firefighter turnout manufacturing plant back in New Hampshire, and I always saw them from the distance of the West Coast as the early Republican primaries, they were so conservative that they would always tilt the Republican Party towards the right because of their preference for conservative candidates. So I went back there not really knowing what to expect to find, and what I found was these absolutely delightful, jovial people who are saddled in a state that finances itself entirely out of the property tax. So they've got the highest property taxes in the country. It's a sole source. They'll fund the schools, the cities, the counties, the roads, I believe, the state. Everything is funded out of the property tax. And it's no wonder that they hate the federal government, because every time they were told to clean up their water, clean up their air, do anything, the costs of doing that were picked up by an increase in their property taxes, the most regressive tax we know. And so that, if that can be one extreme, there's got to be some states that have found to balance the problem of public finance in some way.
What do you think about the notion of a homestead exemption, or up to a certain amount, perhaps up to the average value of a residence? You just take residences around the state, take the average value, say, well, if that's your homestead, that's where you live, the majority of the time where you reside, that you have an exemption, full or partial, for the property taxes on the homestead.
Yeah, and of course that's what we talk about, the kicker, which is simply an artifact, a remnant of the time when property tax was in a crisis state in the late 70s, and along with the kicker and some growth limits, there were the homeowner and renter property tax relief. And we've lost everything but the kicker. And the legislature had an opportunity to look at property tax relief, at least for senior citizens, those on fixed incomes, last year, and chose not to do so. I wish they would have. I think we'd had a few more options available to us.
And you might not have had Measure 47.
I'm convinced of that. We would have had an opportunity to really look at those issues this time without being under the constraints that Measure 47 has now visited upon us.
Well, we only have a little bit of time left, and I'm curious as to how you would like people to relate to Tom Whelan after session, or even Tom Whelan after first term. How would you like to be remembered as you're heading into this and seeing what you want to do?
Well, I hope I'm remembered as a reasonable, down-to-earth guy. I'm a firefighter. I'd say not a politician.
But now you'll be putting out fires in the Capitol.
That's right. And it's a little bit simpler, and a little bit simpler putting out fires in houses and structures out there. I hope I'm approachable. I know I will be. I'll know many more people in the district than I currently know, and I want to take the opportunity both during the session and the interim to have town halls, have breakfasts. I know you've had success with that, and I just want to keep in touch with people. And one of the peculiar things that Salem legislators have the opportunity to do is to meet regularly with their constituents who happen to drop by. If they're coming in from Lakeview, they probably don't come in the numbers that we can expect, and so they'll know where I hold forth, and I'm sure they'll be dropping by whenever they see fit. I hope they do.
And you would hope that people would not call you at home after, say, 9:30 or so at night?
That would be real nice. I've got a recording, a recorder, so they can leave a message. But I'm kind of an early to bed, early to rise guy, and I've got to keep a very rigorous schedule, both personally and during the session. So I'm going to hopefully get to bed early, get up early, and have my day well along before the session starts in the morning.
All right. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Appreciate the opportunity.
And thanks to our audience for joining us. Tom Whelan has been our guest on Capitol Insight. This is the last show. It may run a couple of times, but this is the last show in which I get to be your representative and your host for the show. It's been a pleasure being with you. Take care.